If there is a point of departure capable of inaugurating a journey of inner strength and emotional sovereignty, it manifests in the quiet opening of Psalm 1, as if the ancient voice that once echoed through the desert were not describing a commandment, but an invisible architecture of the human mind. The text does not begin with fire, nor with promises, nor with threats, but with a state of being. Blessed is the man, it is not an order, not an imposition, it is a recognition. As if the ancestral consciousness that shaped this psalm were describing a rare kind of human, someone who has already crossed the fields of confusion and now manifests a differentiated inner center, stable, secret, resistant to the forces that dissolve identity. Psalm 1 is not concerned with religion in the superficial sense. It is concerned with internal architecture, with the way the mind structures itself when it ceases to be a hostage of the external world and begins to operate from an inner axis. To understand its scope, one must go back in time, long before writing, to the period when these verses were not recited but intuited beside nomadic fires. The people who would later give shape to the Psalms lived amid territorial pressures, conflicts, injustice, poverty, and climatic uncertainty. They were a people accustomed to chaos, yet aware that survival would not come from weapons or military strategies alone. They needed something that would sustain the spirit while the body fought against the desert. This archaeopsychological context shapes the tone of Psalm 1. It is not a liturgical poem. It is a psychological manual of internal resistance, a map to prevent the individual from dissolving into the crowd, bowing to cultural pressures, or being dragged along by social forces that disintegrate identity. In this sense, when the psalmist describes the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of mockers, he is not merely speaking about behavior. He is describing 3 layers of psychological dissolution that anyone poor, middle class, or upper middle class faces daily. Walking in the counsel corresponds to the first infiltration. It is when the mind begins to absorb, without noticing, the values, resentments, desires, and narratives of others. Standing in the way is the second stage. The person not only absorbs these things, but begins to identify with them, loses critical judgment, and merges with the flow they initially observe from the outside. Sitting in the seat is the final point. It is when the individual abandons all self-authority and becomes fully possessed by the forces that once seduced them subtly. Thus, the psalmist crafts a kind of spiritual cartography of the fall of human consciousness, describing how personality slowly disintegrates when it loses its internal sovereignty. This description has a deep effect on anyone living in dense social environments, whether the poor person exposed daily to brutal pressures of survival, the middle-class individual struggling against the seduction of collective narratives that seek to homogenize identity, or even the upper middle class, accustomed to environments of influence where the opinion of others becomes a currency of power. In all these cases, the risk is the same: to lose oneself, to disintegrate, to dissolve into the current. Psalm 1 intervenes as a voice rescuing the individual from the psychological abyss of conformity. But this rescue does not occur through commandments. It occurs through symbolic reorientation. The text presents the contrast between 2 inner realities, the tree and the chaff. This is one of the richest metaphors in wisdom literature, functioning here as a psychological portrait of the differentiated human being. The tree represents a consolidated, deep identity that grows from an inner axis. The chaff represents the individual without a center, without an axis, who becomes prey to every cultural, emotional, or social wind. In contemporary psychological terms, the tree is the symbol of the integrated personality, someone who has developed self-mastery, inner strength, and emotional sovereignty. The chaff, on the other hand, is the fragmented, dependent mind that lives off external impacts, incapable of sustaining its own narrative. Modern culture, with its speed, anxiety, and excessive stimuli, produces more chaff individuals than ever. Reactive, nervous, unstable, fragile people, always at the mercy of opinions, consumption, trends, politics, social approval. People who cannot remain alone with themselves for 10 minutes. People who only feel real when someone watches them. Psalm 1 exposes this condition silently and with refinement. It proposes a return to the axis, And this return happens through delight in the law, through continuous meditation, through the mental rooting in something that does not change with the wind. In its deepest sense, this law is not an external code, but an internal principle of psychological order. Meditating on this law day and night does not mean repeating mechanical words, but allowing the mind to bow before something greater than its own fluctuations. It means that the individual ceases to be a slave to instability and becomes guided by a principle of inner coherence. The psalmist describes the state as if it were the natural condition of someone who has rediscovered themselves. The metaphysics of the text is not in the heavens, but in the human mind. Each sentence is a coordinate of personal development, an archetypal instruction for rebuilding individuality. The tree planted by streams of water symbolizes not only stability, but constant access to an inner source of psychological vitality. The stream is the deep unconscious, the symbolic reservoir of consciousness, the part of us that does not depend on external circumstances. When Jung describes the self as the organizing center of the psyche, he is in perfect harmony with the psalmist's image. The tree is the ego integrated into the self. The chaff is the dissolved ego, separated from the self, living only off external stimuli. This distinction cuts across social classes. The poor individual fighting daily for survival may find in Psalm 1 a source of inner strength that enables resistance against despair, fatalism, and the feeling of abandonment. The middle-class person finds a map for not succumbing to emotional exhaustion, social comparison, or the loss of identity under external expectations. The upper middle class, in turn, finds in Psalm 1 protection against arrogance, vanity, and moral dissolution often accompanying access to power. In all these scenarios, Psalm 1 functions as a compass. Regardless of one's social position, exposure to chaos is constant, and the risk of losing oneself is real. The tree represents what everyone seeks, even without realizing it: stability, coherence, meaning, permanence. But becoming a tree is a psychological and spiritual choice that demands discipline. And the psalmist makes this clear by showing that the blessed one is not privileged, but disciplined to keep his mind rooted. When read superficially, the text seems merely to contrast the good and the wicked, the righteous and the unrighteous. But its real depth lies in the way it symbolically describes two patterns of psychological functioning. The righteous is the one whose mind operates from the inside out. The wicked is the one whose mind operates from the outside in. The righteous is a tree, the wicked is chaff. The righteous have an inner source of energy. The wicked live off external impacts. The righteous possess identity. The wicked live through masks. The depth of this psalm reveals itself when we understand that it describes a process of differentiation, a fundamental Jungian concept. To differentiate oneself is to become an individual, to separate from the collective unconscious, to stop existing as an extension of tribe, family, or culture. In other words, to stop being chaff. Psalm 1 describes this process with extraordinary precision. It shows that the first stage of differentiation is refusing to walk in the counsel of the wicked, that is, refusing to act according to what does not arise from within. The second stage is not standing in the path of sinners, meaning avoiding emotional capture by external narratives that promise shortcuts, quick validation, or cheap belonging. The third stage is not sitting in the seat of mockers, that is, not entering the destructive logic of those who live off criticism, irony, mockery, childish mechanisms used by fragile minds to mask insecurity. Thus, the psalmist presents a psychological ritual of mental purification. First, external counsel is removed. Then emotional involvement is avoided. Finally, the identity bond with destructive voices is broken. Only then does the mind become fertile soil for rooting. Like a tree that grows slowly, the individual begins to strengthen identity from within. And this movement, slow, silent, deep, is the foundation of inner strength. The psalmist says that this tree bears fruit in its season. This is crucial. The tree does not hurry. It does not compare. It does not despair. It does not rush to meet external expectations. It produces fruit when the moment arrives, not before, not after. The psychological lesson here is monumental. The differentiated individual does not live according to the world's urgency. They know that everything has an inner time. When someone reaches this state of being, their mind becomes resistant to chaos, their emotions sovereign, their consciousness awakened. Life ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a process of maturation. The psalmist continues, saying that its leaf does not wither. The leaf, in biblical symbolism, represents the visible part of the soul, the outward expression of identity. When the psalmist says that its leaf does not wither, he is describing a rare emotional stability, a constant presence, a coherence that endures adverse psychological seasons. The tree remains. The chaff does not. The chaff is dragged. The chaff is carried by the wind. The chaff has no existential weight. The psalmist describes the wicked not as morally evil, but as psychologically weightless, dissolved, incapable of sustaining their own existence. In ancient times, chaff was thrown into the air on threshing floors to separate the grain from what had no substance. In psychological terms, the wicked person is the individual without substance. They live by appearances, by impulses, by reactivity, to impress, to flee from themselves. The psalmist says they will not stand in the judgment. This does not mean divine punishment, but psychological incapacity to face the truth about themselves. Judgment is clarity, and those who live by fantasies cannot withstand the encounter with their own consciousness. The righteous the tree is the one who remains standing when all illusions dissolve. The psalmist concludes by saying that the way of the wicked will perish. It is not a curse, it is a psychological observation. Paths without inner roots cannot survive time. The chaff does not perish because God condemns it. It perishes because it has no structure. The path perishes because it lacks foundation. Psalm 1, therefore, is a map for constructing the inner structure of the individual. It teaches inner strength, emotional sovereignty, self-mastery, mental reconstruction, spiritual resilience, and awakening of consciousness. It teaches that true strength is not the ability to dominate the world, but the ability not to be dominated by it. It teaches that true emotional maturity is the fruit of rooting and mental discipline. It teaches that resisting chaos is a daily exercise of choosing which voices deserve to enter the inner temple of consciousness. It teaches that identity is built in silence, not in crowds. It teaches that the tree does not grow in the town square, but by the riverbank, far from gazes, nourished by invisible sources. When internalized, this psalm transforms the poor, middle class, or upper middle class individual into someone who does not bow to destiny. Poverty does not define their mind. Middle class pressures do not suffocate their identity. High social position does not corrupt their center. The tree grows where it is planted, but its strength comes from within, not from without. The psalm ends and leaves a trace, a silent invitation for the individual to become more than reactive, to become sovereign. This invitation sustains the modern soul, surrounded by noise, excess, expectations, and anxiety. Psalm 1 is the ancient answer to contemporary confusion. It is the map for those who desire inner strength in a world that ridicules any form of depth. It is the path for those who seek emotional maturity in an era of collective infantilization. It is the axis for those who want to remain standing while everything around them fragments. It is the awakening of consciousness for those who realize that life is not about the quantity of stimuli, but the depth of roots. In the silence of this psalm, the modern soul finds what it has most lost: weight, substance, identity, axis. It finds the center that the wind cannot carry away. It finds the river that never dries. It finds the tree that never falls. And it finds, above all, itself not as chaff, but as a tree growing where the world cannot see, sustained by waters the world does not know.